This is Amy Chan from CakeDecoratingSchool.com, and if you like cake decorating, you're in the right place. Welcome to our Practice With Me series. In this video, we'll be doing basic writing skills. It's broken down into sections so you can skip ahead, rewind, and rewatch as desired. For this practice session, we're going to be using one bag. We're using a 12-inch disposable. You can use whatever you like, whatever you have on hand. We're using it with a coupler because we'll be changing tips, and we're going to be using the following tips for this lesson. A number 4, so this one is a plain round tip. A number 6, this one is also a round tip, just a larger size. A number 8, you can see this one is much bigger than our number 4. And finally, a number 44. This one is a plain, flat basket weave tip. To get started, you're going to want to have a few things on hand. And first and most important is the templates. If you've gone ahead and purchased them, you want to print them out on landscape, full size, so that your letters, numbers, and whatever else we're doing today are the right size. That way they'll match up with the tips you're using and you should have a really easy time following along. You can, of course, follow along without them and just practice your writing with us. That's totally fine too. And if you're already one of our yearly members, this will be on your student platform, so you can go ahead and print them out as well. To practice on, I'm using a clear, you can see it, plexi sign holder. Is 8.5 by 11, so it's the same size as my paper, so it's the perfect thing for me to practice on because it's easy to clean, but it's also easy for you to see what I'm doing and easy for you to see the templates underneath. But you don't have to get something like this. If you already have a commercially available practice board and you want to use that and it's the right size, that's perfectly fine. If you don't and you want something quick, easy, and cheap to practice on that you probably already have on hand, one of the easiest things to do is use some extra parchment paper, an extra cake board. This one's just a little like quarter sheet size, and I've just secured that piece of parchment down with some masking tape and keep some extra on hand so you can tape down your pages, your templates underneath, and that will make a nice little practice board setup for you that you can slip your pages underneath this page, and then you can clean this off when you need to, and you can change out that parchment paper on top when it gets a little messy or if it gets crinkly on you. I'm going to keep a few things to help me clean up on hand as well. So I'll keep myself a nice little offset spatula. I always have tons of these hanging around. It makes it easy to scrape my buttercream off, put it back in my cup, or put it directly back into my bag to keep practicing, and a clean paper towel just to help wipe things down and keep it mess-free so it makes my practicing more precise and easy. And you probably won't see these again because it'll be happening off camera. And finally, our buttercream. We're using some American-style buttercream. You can really use whatever you like for this. It can be practice buttercream. It can even be store-bought practice buttercream that's not made with butter, so you don't have to worry about melting in hot hands. It could be a Swiss or Italian meringue, or even things like royal icing that you don't have to worry about melting and can also reuse if you do it quickly. To color it today, we used a little liquid gel. Here we go, take that out of the background. Just some sky blue, so it has that nice aqua tone to it. So if you're wondering how we made that color, it's just go light on the sky blue and it'll give you that nice kind of robin's egg shade of blue. We're going to be practicing a few different types of alphabets in this lesson, and this first one is a stretched alphabet. So this isn't our normal lettering with the normal height and width ratio. Think about elongating your letters. And you might be thinking, why would we do that? Well, when you're trying to write a lot of stuff in a little space, it naturally is helpful to make them taller. It'll help you make your letters a little more squished and keep your writing neat. So we want to practice this, especially as you get more experienced and you do more stuff and you feel more comfortable writing on cakes. You'll get asked to write larger and larger phrases on them. And it can be helpful to learn how to write taller. So we like our little stretched alphabet as good practice for writing nice, beautiful, elongated, tall letters. So think just like we normally would. We're doing all of our letters in parts. So just like we would for a normal alphabet, we're just giving them less depth or width. And we're making the height nice and exaggerated. And that'll help keep us clear and crisp, keep our openings, while allowing us to write more in less space. So just like we would with a regular alphabet, we want to form all those letters in parts. So just think one line at a time, one piece of the puzzle at a time. Just think about pulling them nice and tall. And if you're new to writing, if you're one of our students, we recommend working through the intermediate certificate that has a really great lesson that's really intensive on writing and practice with a regular alphabet. If you're just joining us on YouTube, you can always check out, we've got a nice little live on writing that goes through the basic alphabet as well. And that basic alphabet is also what we'll use for common phrases that we're going to go over in this lesson as well. So if you want some practice on that, you can always work through those. But this is going to be especially helpful as you get more and more experienced, because you'll want to vary the look of your writing to match the tone and feel of your cake designs. And also, some points, it's just a practical thing where you're just trying to get a lot in a little space. But that's why today we're going to be working on several alphabets, and this is one of them. But it's the same kind of thing where we want to do nice, clean transitions. You can see each little part of each letter is getting kind of formed individually. And every once in a while you might get an air bubble. Don't freak out about those. Just make sure the little tails on each side of that bubble are connected, and then go back and fill it in. If it's really big or something's flopped over, especially if you're working on a cake, just take a moment with a toothpick and just peel that off. If you can. If you can't, just go in and scrape it off, resurface, and redo your work. I always like to give it an attempt to pull something up with a toothpick or another small implement like that. Maybe the tip of a tapered offset spatula first before I go for the scrape and resurface. That can save you a lot of time. And I think it's especially apparent visually with things like the H's, where we're making those parallel lines really close together. That this will take up a lot less space. So just naturally making those first lines longer than you normally would. Oh, I'm getting a lot of air bubbles. And then closer together will allow you to condense everything and fit more in less space. You can see I don't do a lot of flares on the top of the letters too. So things like I's, J's, where normally maybe we would put those little bars across, we're just leaving those off. And that's also going to take up less space. So we'll keep stuff like that for T's where it's essential and really part of the letter. And we're going to leave it off anywhere like I's, the tops of J's, where it's not really essential. And think about things like K's. We're not pulling it out too far. We're going almost straight down. And that will keep those really narrow as well. We'll go down to second line and work on our L. Nice and tall. Little bar across on the bottom. Very short. Still looks like an L. Get a curve on the bottom of that one just to make it look different than our capital I. And things like the M, we're only going to pull down about halfway. We're squishing it together, so if we try to go all the way down, it's going to end up a little muddied, where all of this is going to kind of join together and it might make it hard to read. So by only coming down halfway on this, we give ourselves a gap there and make sure that even though it's kind of condensed, the letter is still legible. And this can be a great way to not only give those letters some character, but also make sure that people don't have problems reading whatever you've written on your cake. For our N, we're just going to do a little tap there on top, down, and up. For your O, just keep it nice and close so you can do a sharp little curve. So think ovals instead of circles for these. So I just want to be high enough up that I'm not digging into my frosting and making it look messy. But I don't want to go as high up as I would for, say, a straight line. Or if I were doing fatter letters and I want a softer curve. You can see a lot of things like the P's, the D's, those spaces, they're almost boxed off just a little bit. We're coming out a little bit and then going almost straight down. Our Q is going to be very similar to our O. We're just going to give it a nice little bar there on the diagonal. And then go opposite of our P for our lowercase q. R's, just keep that curved part really nice and slim. And here on this little tail down, instead of kicking it far out, if you need to, even curve it a little to help keep it closer. That'll keep it looking like an R without it taking up too much space. And for our S's, we just want to go up nice and high, curve around right under itself. It's kind of like with the O's. If we keep nice and tight to the surface, you can really control where that's going and really help keep it compact. When we do things like little crossbars on our T's, think about just kind of like jumping over the line. We don't want to make them too long because that's going to take up space and kind of ruin the look if we're doing this written as a phrase. So think of starting just on the left side, pulling up and over, and finishing just on the right side. So basically just enough space to get over that line in the center clearly without actually going any real distance. For the U, think about just doing a skinny O, except we're finishing straight on the top. And then for things like V's, it's really pretty easy. Just go nice and narrow there and come right back up. Same thing for the lowercase, just a little less height. For our W, we just want to tap at our transitions. And this is one where you can pull it all the way up. Or if you're worried about things being too close together, just pull it halfway up. Things like that are kind of personal preference and what you feel you can accomplish cleanly. But if things are looking too smushed and a little muddled, just go halfway, kind of like we did on our M up there. I intentionally did these two letters different ways just to give you a good example. The X is really simple. Think about just making that slope of that line a little steeper, more so than we normally would. On a normal alphabet, you might be a lot closer to like 45 degrees, and that'll make those letters a lot wider. So think about just kind of making that line have a steeper angle to it, and that'll help crunch it together. Same thing with a lowercase x. And very similar vibe with that Y. So instead of pulling from further out to a center point, it's just basically a skinnier little V or a steeper slope to that line there in the center. For our Z's, we're just going to touch at the corner and not make them too fat. So think just not making those bars on the ends too fat, and that'll kind of naturally keep you in a small space. So if we don't draw too long for that first line, then we get a diagonal that meets up with it that doesn't take up too much space. And there we have our stretched alphabet. I hope you enjoyed practicing this with us. If it felt a little awkward to begin with, because it can, trying to make these letters a lot skinnier, scrape it off and give it another go. Just kind of work through it until you feel comfortable and then move on. Now we're going to practice our dot alphabet. And this one we're also going to use a number 4. We're going to be doing those dots on there, so don't use a tip that's too large because that can kind of muddle things up. And this is a good one if you're still having trouble with your starts and your finishes and your little direction changes, because after we do our lines for our letters, we're going to go in and place little dots at those terminals. And I like to do all the major ones, and that'll cover up most of those little blemishes. And I don't like to do every single one because it can get a little too crowded. So I don't always do things like dots on the ends of the crossbars on the A, or on things like the ends of some of the crossbars on the E's and F's and such, just because it can get a little too crowded. It's also great practice for doing really clean dots. So we're just going to make our letters like normal. And do those dots to help give it a little extra finish. And you could definitely use larger tips if you're, say, working on a larger surface. Like if you're working on something big like a half sheet, you want to use a larger tip and give that writing a little extra flair by doing some little dots on the ends. It's definitely possible. But for our practice alphabet today, since we're working, we want to do the whole alphabet, both upper and lower case, in a relatively small area. We're using a small tip. So it's always a good idea to pick appropriate size tip for the job. Because if you go too large, it can be hard to get everything in there. So piping our letters is just going to be the same as normal. We're just doing those beautiful little dots right there on the end. And like everything else, take your time. Going nice and slow, in general, means nice and neat. Taking your time, piping with control. Making sure you make nice, clean lines, clean transitions. When you do letters like D's, make sure you're going over underneath where your line is going to be, so you get that nice, clean finish. Over here on my E, give myself extra room. I like to pull the top and the bottom a little longer than the one in the middle. And that'll give you some more room to put those little dots on there. And I like to put dots on the corners too, but not there in the middle. It gets a little too crowded and can muddy things up a tiny touch. Nice and close to the surface when we do our curves. And then the cross for our E. Just a little dot to finish that off. This is also a great one if you're having trouble getting everything kind of lined up, because even when you do a letter a little short, you can put the dot down there right underneath it at the end. As long as they're still connected, no one's going to know that maybe you were a little off on your spacing. It means you can kind of adjust the height and the length of those letters and help even everything up and make your writing a little straighter, even if maybe it wasn't to begin with. So it's one of those tools you can use to kind of help make everything look a little cleaner, which is also why it's a great one for beginners to practice. Not only are you practicing two skills, both your dots and lines, but it can help solve some of the problems that you might experience by covering up the ends of those lines with your dots and making your writing on your cakes look more level by allowing you just a little grace, a little wiggle room to adjust the height. Kind of help get everything lined up and level. So at any point, if you need to, take a minute to stop, dump your bag, mix your buttercream around and reload it if it's gotten a little too warm. Typically for me, if I'm doing stuff like writing, I'll notice it starts to flow out a little faster. Maybe get some little wiggles in my letters. So it's always a good idea to kind of monitor that temperature. Make sure it's not getting too warm, because just like if it's too cold, that can also create some issues for you when you're trying to work. And it's always better to take a second, stop, adjust your bag, adjust the temperature of your buttercream, versus, especially if you're working on a cake, having to scrape things off and start over. Now, this is more of a problem if we're doing lots of work like we're doing today, where we're practicing multiple alphabets and phrases. If you're on a cake, if you're using the same bag to do multiple details and your writing, before you go in to do your writing, just make sure you check. Make sure things are flowing nicely, but hasn't gotten too soft or too warm on you. Beautiful. We're working through our alphabet pretty quickly. Just keep in mind if it feels like you go slower, that's okay, especially to begin with. Slow and steady is going to win the race and give you the neatest look and the cleanest letters. Speeding up typically means hand strength and being able to squeeze harder. And that's a skill that takes time. It's like any other muscle, it's going to take time to build up. So to begin with, I feel like, I can't really go fast. Just know that that's something that everyone experiences. And building up speed is going to take time and practice, because you don't want to be squeezing so hard that you strain the muscles in your poor little hands. That's no good for anyone. And trying to go faster can often mean breaks in your lines and redoing work. Because if you can't squeeze fast enough, the frosting can't come out fast enough to make a nice clean line. So if you find you're getting lots of breaks as you're going, slow down your movements a touch. Be nice and focused, nice and intentional, and remind yourself occasionally to take it nice and slow. Turns cake decorating almost into a meditative exercise, which I like. I like to get in a nice, calm, focused place and just work, and I find it really relaxing, which is awesome. There we go. Second line done. Come down here, draw a nice oval, and finish it with a dot. And those are one of those, you can really put the dot anywhere. I put it where I start and finish. So there's a nice little kind of finishing detail, a little flourish covering up that little joint where my line begins and ends. Some people prefer to start other places. I always like to put the dot on top of that little beginning and end kind of joint, just to make for a nice clean finish. So if you start at the bottom, because some people do, you can always put the dot at the bottom. Capital Q is going to be very similar. We're just going to do a little line across, and then add our dots to give it just a little bit of flair. Anytime you need to, make sure you clean off your tip. If you need to, dump, mix your buttercream, reload your bag. If it's a warm day, you can always take a minute and chill things down a tiny touch, especially if you're working in a warm space. Practicing your alphabets doesn't require quite the stability of, say, piping flowers, but it can still get messy and sloppy, just like working on your flower nail can if things get too warm. doing whole alphabets like that, you're piping quite a bit, so it'll probably take you some time to get through it, meaning you're holding your bag quite a bit. And you can always make more than one bag too, so you can change between them while you're working, if that's helpful. You can take less breaks and less pauses. And we'll finish ourselves up with our last few letters. When I do things like these, rather than making 2 lines, I'm just going to do a really nice contact with the surface at that change, and then change directions. I'll do the same with the W. Touch, touch, touch. And then that way we don't have to make 4 separate lines. And that'll help you speed up a little bit. And you can do that on letters like your V's, W's, even the A, to help speed yourself up just a tiny touch. If you're new to piping though, just make 4 separate lines for these. It'll take a little more time, but it'll be a little easier to get a nice clean effect. We want to prioritize good techniques and clean finishes over speed. And once your piping looks nice and neat, nice and clean, then you can start working on speeding things up. So we want to build up our skills first, and then work on getting a little faster. We'll do our last couple of letters. There. And we'll get our lowercase c. And this is also another one where you can tap instead of making every line separately. And there we go. We have our finished little dot alphabet. It's got some nice little flourishing details with those dots at the ends of our letters. And that's a great way to kind of cover up those little beginnings and ends of lines if they're not quite looking crisp and clean yet and don't have perfect finishes, because we get that little dot on there. It's also a way to help adjust the level of our writing. So that way, if you're writing on a cake and maybe things aren't perfectly level, you can always go back and add those little dots on the ends and tops of letters to help kind of even and straighten things out. So it's a nice little way to kind of hide some of those blemishes that we might see, especially if you're a beginner. If you feel comfortable, move on to the next section. If you feel like you still need some work, scrape it off and give it a try again, or come back to it later. Now we're going to practice a bold alphabet. So for this one, we're using a number 8 tip. So we switched to a nice large round tip. And because we're doing these letters about the same size as the other alphabets that we've been doing in this lesson, you can see that they appear chunkier and fatter. They have kind of a puffy, almost cloud-like look. So sometimes when we're doing cakes, we want the look of whatever we're writing to match the feel and tone of the cake. Maybe tie in with some of the themes and the design. So it's a nice little thing to kind of have on hand to be able to write with various different tips and give ourselves various different looks. So it's going to take a little bit of practice writing with a tip this big in this size. So if it doesn't go well the first time, know you're in good company. Scrape it off and try it again. So we still want to get nice, neat letters. So we want to practice same form, same idea, forming each part of each letter individually really taking our time, going in slow, and that'll allow it to be neat and help you keep that definition. So really take your time. Form each part. Make nice, clean starts and finishes to your letters. Don't be afraid to do things close together. Whether that's just the curves on the letters, even the different parts, making them kind of nice and smushed gives it that nice kind of puffy feel. And if it looks a bit crowded, it kind of adds to the effect, making it look nice and bold. And just take my time. Clean off your tip whenever you need to, especially because we're doing nice, large, big letters. You might get a little excess on the end there. And if it's hanging out, sometimes it can kind of affect the finish on your letters. So don't be afraid to stop. Clean the end of your tip off. It can really help you make things look nice and neat. There we go. For things like the F, just start on one side of your line, pull up and over, and finish directly on the other. Don't think about pulling too long. Think about just going over that line, and that'll give you a nice little crossbar without it taking up too much space and looking awkward. For our G, we're just going to do a line across the top. To give it a nice finish. As you come to the end of the first line, if you need to, stop, empty your bag, dump and remix. Make sure things aren't getting too warm on you if you need to. Since everything we're doing is kind of so big and puffy, if it starts to get sloppy, it can get messy really quickly. So this one will probably be a little bit of a challenge. Make sure if you haven't already, practice some of the more traditional style alphabets, like maybe the dot or that tall stretched out one, just to warm yourself up a little bit. This one is one of those ones that seems kind of deceptively simple, but writing with a bigger tip, especially when we're keeping it kind of small, the letters, can actually take a bit more skill. And you can, of course, keep this effect even if you're writing in bigger spaces and doing bigger size letters by just using much larger tips. Like if you need to write really big, you could use your large decorator tips, like an 808 or an 806. For things like your M's, you could always do the tap to change directions instead of making each line separately. If you're just starting out and you want to make each line individually, that's perfectly fine. It's a great way to practice those lines as a beginner and make sure everything's nice, neat, and crisp. O's are just the same as they always are. Just nice and close to the surface to remain in control, and a nice clean touch to finish. Capital Q starts out just the same as the O. We're just going to do a little line. So think tap in the center, just pull right over and end. That way it doesn't end up being too long. S's, just stay nice and close so you can control that curl as it goes around, especially on the smaller one. That lowercase c is just like the other ones where we've done crossbars. Sorry, lowercase t, where we just start on one side, go up over the line, and finish on the other end. For your V's and W's, you can tap to change directions. And for your X's, just make sure you're going nice 45 degrees. For that lowercase one, just draw it a little out past when you're going over. For your Z, you can also do the tap to change. And there we have a nice little puffy cloud alphabet. It may take just a little getting used to using that larger tip to write with. So if you're feeling fairly confident, you can move on and keep practicing other things. But if you need to, stop, scrape it off, and work through it again. The more you do them, just like anything, the better you'll get. Now we're going to do an alphabet with our flat tips. So think this is a basket weave tip. It's plain on both sides, so we don't have that texture and we don't have to worry about accidentally flipping our tip upside down. So we're going to get kind of nice, flat, smooth lines. And we're going to use this to make all the parts of our letters. So for this, because it's a little new, it's a little different than using a round tip, I'm only doing the capital letters because they're going to be easier to do. And we're going to use it just like we would our regular tip. We're going to start out touching, squeeze, touch down, and make the base of our A. And then when we do any little crossbars, lines that need to be skinny, we're just going to pull across like that on the side. Mine kind of sank in just a little bit, so give it a little more definition. But this is a great way to make a different style of alphabet, it has a different feel, different look, and a different tone. To the letters, and it kind of reminds me of using pens for calligraphy because we get those big, fat, bold areas with it. So for our C, we're just going to trace the line like we normally would and let the tip do its thing. So it's going to naturally kind of fold over on itself and give us those great little changes. You don't really have to do anything, and it'll give you these beautiful, fun effects. So just slide out for the D, pull down, and then back. Things like our E, just want to make sure you pull the top and the bottom a little longer. That will help give them a little separation and a little definition. And on things like this, I often pull the top and the bottom all the way from the back, and I just start the middle one from the edge. That helps it look smaller. And I'll do the same thing with my F, where I pull the line on the top all the way from the back edge. And that little one right there from that kind of inside edge. I'm going to start my G out just like I did my C. Pull to the side, and then down to give it a finish. And just go all the way across, edge to edge for your H. I's, really simple, just a single flat line. For your J, just curve there at the end, and it'll do its thing for you. So this kind of alphabet requires us to turn the bag just a little more. Because we're going so fat, I'm only going to come halfway down with that M. Doing that, only going halfway down with that M, will help keep it looking neat and too crowded or claustrophobic. And just do our N just by gently touching at each little terminal before we change directions. And just for your O, pick a place to start, top or bottom. Go down, circle around, let that frosting fold over on itself. It'll do its little trick. And then just pull up and touch the stop. I'm going to treat my Q just like I would an O to start. And then we'll just go in and add that little line to finish it off. For the R on this one, I like to curve that bottom line just a little bit. I feel like it goes with the rest of the alphabet. It's just a little bit easier. Now our S is one where we're going to let our frosting kind of fold over. So just think about keeping that bag straight up and down and drawing an S, and the frosting will kind of do its thing for you. It'll give you those neat little kind of curves, little swoops where it overlaps. And it'll just kind of automatically do it for you, just like it does on your C's and your O's. Same thing for the U. We're just going to let it fold over naturally, just by keeping it straight up and down and drawing that shape just like we would with a regular plane tip. For V's and W's, it's going to be like M's and N's, where we're just going to touch at that change of direction and keep going. And if it's too messy to pull all the way up in the middle for your W, you can always do a little half C to help give it some more definition. I'm just going to pull my short line first, and then do the second half all as one. I find that makes the Y a little neater in this style, just because I can cover up that little tail. For my Z, I'm going to do my diagonal first, and then I'm going to go in and do my little lines across, meeting up with it. And there we have an alternate style flat alphabet. This one might take a little more getting used to because we're going to do some different things with our bags than we would when we're using just a regular plain round tip. So if you need to, scrape it off, practice it again, practice a few more times until you feel comfortable, and then move on to the next section. We're going to start out with our numbers and symbols. So I've got my number 6 on my bag, and we're going to start just with a 1 and work our way through. And we wanted to do, obviously, 1 to 9 and then a 0, because that allows you to pretty much create any number you want to, and then also do some common symbols that you might see. And we're going to handle numbers just like we would writing. We're going to make each segment kind of separately, and if you've done this before, if you've done some writing and you've formed your individual parts, more so than lifting away between each one, focus on touching, stopping momentarily, and then going again. So we're kind of picking up a little bit of speed, and we're just holding our bag straight up and down. You want to touch, squeeze, drop into place, take a moment at each of those joints to make a nice, clean line. And then any place we have to start a nice new one, do the same thing. Touch, squeeze, let it drop down into place, and then touch again at the end before lifting away. We've got some curves in our numbers. So just think about, lift up a tiny touch, but not too much that you lose control of your line. And anywhere you need to make a definite change, make sure you're touching down and really making contact with the surface before you pull in your new direction. Just keep going. Nice and slow. There we go. And 4s can be a little tricky. Take a little courage. I like to start with the little arm across. You can always do that kind of upside down V shape and then do the arm across if that's a little more comfortable. So try doing it a few different ways before you move on, just to see what's most comfortable for you. Because as long as it looks like the right number, that's really all that matters, not the order that you do things in. Gorgeous. And the 8 is a little bit tricky. It's a bit like an infinity sign. You want to think about just curling around, down, and back up. So pick a starting point. I like to start at the top. Some people prefer to start at the bottom. That's going to be more personal preference than anything else. Just make sure you pull up enough to get that little bar that goes across around without interfering with the line that you did before. So if you're too close, you'll kind of sweep into it and smash into it. Just make sure you lift up as you go across a little bit to make sure you're clearing that first line that you made. As we keep going with our numbers, just go nice, slow and steady. You can see I'm just lifting up enough that I get a nice smooth stream of frosting that just drops down into place for me without losing control of my curves. And that's important. Just stay nice and just right there. And allow you to really control where your frosting goes. When we get down to our symbols, you can see we've got a lot more going on, especially with things like our little ampersand. We want to start with the line behind. I find that's easiest. Come up and then curve around. And this is definitely my personal preference for doing these. If you do this and it feels awkward, try going in reverse order. Some people are going to prefer to start with that tail, go up, and then come down. So try it both ways before you go on to your question mark to make sure that's the way that feels most comfortable to you. That'll really help you build up your confidence before doing anything on a cake. Question marks are pretty easy. The main thing is just get enough space between the bottom and your dot so they look fully separate. And make sure you get a nice clean finish on your dot. Same thing for exclamation marks. And then we've got some that seem more use now, like our little @ symbol. Make that tiny little A in the middle and then loop all the way around. And that's a good one to practice if you're doing anything social media related, which comes up a lot. And so does the hashtag or a number sign. And this one is a great one for practicing parallel lines, getting things kind of nice and even in that spacing. When you're going across, just make sure you're lifting up enough that you clear your lines underneath. And try to get an even spacing between both sets of lines, along with making them nice and parallel. And you can see we've finished our set of numerals and symbols, and we're ready to move on to the next task. Now we're going to work on some common phrases, including our thank you. And for this, we're using a number 4 tip. So I've changed the tip on my bag. Just make sure you have the right one on there before you get started. And we're going to practice writing out thank you some. And this is something you can do over and over again so you feel comfortable. We did it kind of on the large side so that you can practice a couple of times, wipe off, and keep practicing until you feel comfortable. But we're not doing too small that it ends up being tedious. And we're going to use our number 4 tip. And when you're thinking about writing, really think about holding that bag straight up and down, making your lines, keeping everything kind of lined up, and making each section of your letter separately. So to start with, we're going to do our T. Just come in there, make a nice, smooth, long line, and then get that crossbar on top because it's a capital. And when you're doing your H, think about making it the same height as that T. So that nice, long, clean line, we're lining up at the bottom and the top. And you can see dropping those lines into place. And when we want to make that little curve on the H, don't be afraid to touch, start squeezing, curl around, and straight down. I think writing is one of those things where we tend to get a little nervous, and that makes us want to speed up. But speeding up is really the enemy, and going slow is what's going to make it look nice and neat. So this is not one of those things where you can or should kind of rip it off like a Band-Aid. You should go nice and slow and steady, and slow and steady is what's going to win the race for you. And don't be afraid to touch your lines. You won't destroy them. It'll give you nice, clean starts. Touch the surface as well. You can see we've lined you up underneath thank you, so it's nice and centered. And that A is kind of right above that O. It's a little different, a little off on spacing. That was just a little bit ahead. And that's so everything kind of lines up naturally with how wide we make the letters. But that's kind of a general rule of thumb. The A is the middle of thank you approximately, and the O is middle of you. So if they're kind of lined up, then everything's going to be centered underneath each other. That way, if you're writing them on 2 lines instead of 1, you can get everything kind of centered underneath each other without worrying about it looking like it's too off-centered or too funny. And some people prefer to do their Ys by doing the little V shape on top and then making the line underneath. Some people prefer to do down to the middle and pull down and then do that second line off to the side. Depending on your own personal preference, you might prefer it one way or the other. So give both a try and see what feels most comfortable to you. Just take our time with those nice little circles. And keep going. Beautiful. Once I'm done with one, I'm just going to move over and work on my other 2. And if you get a little air bubble, just remove and keep going. If you're working on a cake and that happens, A lot of times I just gently use a toothpick or another small implement like that just to remove any offending kind of parts of lines, and then I can keep going. So think just a little skilled precision removal can easily remove a mistake and allow you to keep going. When you're doing nice full long letters, some people prefer to pull top down, others prefer bottom up. That's something else you can give a try while you're working. I like going bottom up just because it kind of gives me a nice finish there on the bottom, and it helps me line everything up. But you might find that the opposite is true for you. So I'm going to give my Y different treatment on this one. You can see I did that right side and then down, and then pull up. And that's actually my preferred style. And you'll notice when I do letters like U's, A's, D's, where I'm doing a curve first and then a straight line, I like to make sure that it extends into the area where the straight line is going to cover up. And then make that line over top. And that makes sure everything is fully connected. So that's something to work on if you haven't yet. Really judging that spacing, making sure everything's connected. And you have nice finishes. And that'll give you beautiful letters. You can see when I start things like that N, I'm starting really touching that line to give myself a clean start and make sure the frosting of that curve is attached to the line. And I don't have things picking up and flying away on me. And it feels a little counterintuitive because it feels like you're knocking into it and knocking it out of alignment, but it doesn't really. It'll go right back for you as soon as you start moving. And if you get that every once in a while, when I touch down, it doesn't quite fully connect and it wants to pull up on me. If it does that, just gently move it back into place and touch down again. And usually you can get it to stick for you. Every once in a while, you'll find it just won't want to stick to the surface of your cake, or in this case, our practice board that we're working on. Like air bubbles, that happens to everyone. And we'll give ourselves one last bar just to finish it up. And there we have 3 beautiful sets of thank yous. I'm feeling pretty comfortable, so I'm going to move on to my next phrase. But if you need to, scrape this off and keep practicing it until you feel nice and comfy with your thank yous. Let's give happy birthday a try. This is a really common one you'll get asked to write on cakes. And for this, we're using a number 4 tip. We want to make sure that when we're writing, especially happy birthday, because it's long, if you're trying to write it all out next to each other, you're typically going to write happy above birthday, maybe write a name underneath. You want that P kind of lined up with that line on the H. There'll be 4 letters behind it and kind of 3 after it, but you can see The H, D, and kind of Y have a wider profile than some of our skinnier letters up there. So that's going to make it so it's approximately centered. And I always like to think that my Y extends past the end on happy, and the B is out front of the H, and that's some good visual spacing for me with the size I make my letters to make sure that everything's kind of lined up. So once I write happy, I like to come out to the side and write that B, and then that should line me up so that my Y is extending right afterwards and everything looks perfectly centered, with birthday directly underneath happy and everything kind of in the middle, and we're not kind of wonky or off to one side. So just kind of keep that in mind for some general rules on spacing when you're writing happy birthday on cakes and you're writing it stacked like this. So let's start in with our number 4 tip and our H. So we're just going to touch, make a nice line, second one parallel to it, and then touch there to really make our crossbar connect, and touch the other side before we stop squeezing and pull away. With my P's, I like to start at the bottom. Some people like to start at the top. You can try it both ways to see what feels best for you. You just want to make sure that the bottom of the curve on our P lines up with the bottom of our H's and our A's. Do our second one right next to the first one. Just want to mimic that as closely as possible. And the bottom of our Y there should line up with the bottom of the curve on our P. And we've got a nice happy going on. Let's give birthday a try. So just kind of practice thinking about that spacing. Follow the line from the H down. Come over enough to give your birthday a start. And get going. I like to make both of those curves separately, so do one and then do the second one. And then just like most of my writing, when I'm doing these little letters that have those lines, I like to start at the bottom and go up because it's a little bit easier to judge where to start and stop and how to keep everything lined up. And you can dot and cross your letters as you go, or you can wait till the end. I like to dot and cross as I go and then give myself a double check to make sure that I haven't missed anything. This, I feel like, makes sure that I'm leaving enough space between my letters too. I don't do my H's too close to my T's and not leave room for that crossbar. But it definitely can be quicker to go through and do everything and then go back and do your dots and those little crossbars and things like T's. So just keep that in mind and try practicing both ways. And there we go. We've done the first one. Let's give the second one a try. We're going to keep focusing on the same kinds of things, making sure that it's all written nice and level, that one word is centered under the other, that we're getting things approximately the same height when it comes to the full height letters and the half height letters so that we get a really neat finish. That went even quicker than the first one. So I'm just gonna pull down from my H, go over a big space to leave room for that capital B, and start birthday. I think this time I'll leave dotting my I's and crossing my T's to last, just to give that a try, almost automatically. And the key with that is to make sure and double check your work if you're going to do it that way before you move on, so you're not accidentally breaking down your bag and your cake still needs a few details. And I think if anyone's decorated cakes enough, they've done that at least once or twice. It's always a bummer when it happens, but if you do it at some point, know that you're in good company. So some people find it easier and quicker to go back and do dots and little crossbars on T's at the end of their words. Congratulations. It's one of those phrases that you're going to whip out on a lot of occasions, whether it's a graduation or another life event. This is a really common one to write on a cake, and you can see it's quite long. And sometimes people have trouble with the spelling. So you want to make sure you practice this, really practice getting those letters clear so you can get a really clear phrase to write on your cake. And just the single word really encompasses a lot, and you don't often need to write much else because a lot of times the cake is decorated for the actual event, so you only need to write the one word. And as long as you write it clearly and spell it correctly, you should be good to go. So just take your time forming those letters, making sure they're really nice and crisp and clear. And anytime you need to, while you're working, clean off your tip. To make sure you get those nice, crisp, clean starts and finishes. Because extra buttercream can kind of get in your way. It can kind of lead things astray, make them curl, make them twist, or leave buildups at your starts and finishes of your letters and your lines. And as you're working, if you need to, make sure you're periodically pushing your buttercream down and twisting your bag. That way you keep pressure on it as much as you need to. A lot of times I just do that periodically. Maybe after a word, or if it's a long word, halfway through. And eventually that'll become something that you do almost without thinking on a regular basis. So it's like anything, the more you practice, the easier it'll get. And the more like second nature it will be. Go straight, curve. And S's can be a little tricky. Just go nice and tight, really close to the surface, just above it enough that you get a smooth line, but not too high that you lose control. Once we're finished with one, we're just going to repeat it a couple of times. And as you go, it'll probably get a little bit quicker and a little easier. So just like anything else, the more times you do something, the more you work on it, the quicker, more efficient, and more precise you'll be able to be. But you can see with writing, even when I speed up, we're still taking our time. It's just a little bit faster. You never want to go too fast because you'll end up with things like breaks and pops in your lines. So you just want to make sure that even if you're working on speeding up a little bit, you're not speeding up too much that you give yourself problems. Because taking your time doing this is always infinitely quicker than having to scrape things off and start all over. And there is nothing worse than realizing you've messed up whatever phrase or word you're writing on a cake, and you're going to need to scrape it off and resurface things. And possibly destroy some of your beautiful work. All right, we're down to our last one. By the time we get here, it should feel much easier. Don't be afraid to work close to yourself. I kind of have to have my stuff a little further away than I would actually normally like, just so that it films well on camera. But you can always pull your work really close to yourself, lock in your elbows, use both hands. If you haven't noticed, I'm actually using my left hand to brace my right wrist and give myself a little extra support. Typically when I'm writing, I actually keep my hand up there by the bag, usually on the coupler, but that kind of blocks the view for everyone. So when I'm doing things on camera, just pull it down back here and just brace my wrist. But you want to focus on stability and setting yourself up for success so that when you go to do your writing, it's as easy as possible. And sometimes when I'm on cakes, depending on how my cake is set up, what shape it is, how big it is, sometimes I do have to brace back here on my arm. So it can be a good idea, especially when we're doing little practice sessions like this, to practice both ways so they both feel comfortable. That way, when you get pretty far into your cake decorating journey, And you have to start working on odd things. You're comfortable bracing your arm instead of being up there right next to the bag, because you might not always be able to get that second arm up there and be really stable. I find that more so true when I'm working on things that are really tall, really high, have a lot of height, or I'm working in an awkward position. But you can see I finished my 3 congratulations, and we're going to scrape this off and move on. But if you still feel like you need to do a little more work, scrape it off and give it another go. Maybe 1, 2, 3, as many times as you need until you feel nice and comfortable. We're going to work on some common phrases for things like baby showers or events involving a new baby. And the 3 that I see the most and have done the most is it's a girl, it's a boy, and then welcome baby. Sometimes after baby, you might even put in the parent's last name or the actual baby's name if you know it. So those are some pretty common generic ones that are good to practice in preparation if you're going to be doing a lot of celebration cakes or if you have some coming up in your own family. So let's get started over here with it's a girl. And since it would be kind of long all written out, we've done it on top of itself so we can practice centering it. And I'm just going to start over here with my eye and think one line up the center, and then just do those little crossbars both on top and on bottom. We'll start on the bottom with my T, just to make sure I get that height right and lined up with my eye. Make sure I get my apostrophe in there. I like to do them as I go. Some people like to go back and do them. Sometimes I feel like that leaves space for me to forget. It also means I leave enough space between the letters and things aren't too squished that it's hard to get in there and looks like maybe you forgot it and squished it in. So I like to do them as I go, but that's more of a personal preference. I'm going to leave a nice space before our second word. And when you're doing things like A's, you can touch down and stop completely, or you can touch down and pause and then keep going. So this is one of those things that if you're a beginner, I recommend touching down, stopping completely, and forming the second part of that letter all by itself. If you've got some practice, you can work on kind of speeding yourself up by anytime there's one of those little V kind of joints, touching down, pausing briefly, and then going again. And that'll kind of speed you up just a little bit on your work and make it flow a little nicer. And you can see, come down here, and we're lining up our G, and it's just inset a little bit from our I, because this word has 4 letters, and the one on top, we have 3, but we also have that space between the word it's and a, and that counts, think, as a letter as well. So that's 5 letters and 4 letters. So we want to be a little inset with the G to make sure we stay centered. So it's important when you're writing more complex phrases, especially, to count the spaces between words when you're trying to get things centered and lined up. And that will help you a lot. And there we go. We've got it's a girl. Move on and work on it's a boy. So of course, going to start out just the same, which is great reinforcement. And then when we come down here for boy, you'll notice it's a little further in. This is only 3 letters. The B is kind of a big one, but not that big, and we want it to be centered. So we're going to start it just kind of right after that I, instead of kind of like halfway through like that one is. So if you can see where girls lined up, the start of the G kind of lines up with that center line, the vertical one on the I, whereas with boy, it lines up with the ends of those crossbars. So it's just a little bit more inset because we're only 3 letters instead of 4. So it's kind of a good rule of thumb for the spacing on those two. Let's go in here and get our Y on there. And then in order to get a third phrase in here, I wrote welcome baby all in one line. And this would be great for a sheet cake, but if you're working on smaller cakes, just put baby beneath welcome. So let's go in here. W's are one of those ones where we have our kind of like V-shaped points on letters. So think about tapping, making contact with the surface, and that'll give you a clean direction change, kind of without stopping. So if you've got some experience writing, maybe you're working your way through this video and you're feeling pretty confident, you can give that a try. If you're still feeling a little tentative, just form each part of the letter individually, and that'll keep it nice and clean. But that's one thing to work on as you're building up your skills, is getting any letters like that. So think A's, B's, W's that have those nice sharp, clean points at them. And that's the place where you can kind of speed yourself up just a little bit. And it won't impact the quality of your writing negatively. It'll actually make it nice and crisp and clean. Let's come in here, especially with the E's. We want to do a nice C first, and then draw our line across. And that'll give us a nice crisp E, even if you're working tight and small, that keeps that nice little hole in the center so it's not lost and our writing doesn't get muddled and possibly illegible. So I'm going to make sure we leave enough space in between words, especially when we're doing them on the same line. So think at least a letter's worth of a gap to make sure things don't run together. Just take your time forming each part, getting those nice, clean, crisp transitions. And then I put a little exclamation point on the end of this one. And you can feel free to add your punctuation as you want to any of your phrases. We've finished this. If you're feeling confident, go ahead and move on to the next section. If you need to, swipe it off, give it another go, and make sure you feel real comfortable before proceeding. We're going to do some holiday phrases now, and I'm just writing out the two that I probably do the most of and use the most, and that would be Happy Holidays and Happy New Year. Happy Holidays is a great one, especially if you're doing maybe some generic themed cakes, like think some generic fall decorations, you write Happy Holidays on it. It can cover all your holidays in fall. Same thing with wintertime as well, so it makes it a great one that'll help you appeal to a lot of people and help kind of cut down on waste because you're not writing specific holidays on them. And then for New Year's, well, Happy Holidays works for that too, but it's one of those specific ones that pretty much everyone celebrates the end of the year, whether that's the Gregorian calendar or the lunar calendar, it works for both. So those are two nice phrases that end up being just maybe a touch generic, but cover a ton of holidays for you and can make it so that you can kind of cut down on some of the waste in terms of sales, especially if you're doing this for a small business. But they're also useful if you're just doing stuff at home and taking things, say, to friends' parties and stuff like that, where maybe you're celebrating with a lot of people. So let's start over here with Happy Holidays. We're going to start in with our H's. and just make some beautiful, crisp, clean straight lines. Make sure they're all nice and lined up. Going with our A's. And anytime we're doing things like A's or D's, just make sure you start and end that A right underneath where you're going to put the line going down. That's going to help make sure that it's covered up and it looks nice and clean. Take your time with those P's. Make sure their little tails drop down low. And our little curve ends in line with the bottom of the rest of our letters. Same thing with the Y. I find it easiest to do that first, the little line on the left side, to make sure it lines up with everything else, and then put the longer line on next. When we come down for holidays, if you look at our spacing, you can see that the H almost lines up. So think the end of this one almost lines up with the start of this one, and you go out a space. So think that kind of 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch, however wide you're making your H's, out here to give it a start. And that should line you up so that holidays is centered under happy. We like to make sure our dots are nice and clean. D's are another one. Make sure you start over underneath where that line is going to go, so we get a nice clean finish. And then when we're doing our S's, just stay close enough to the surface that you can control where it goes, but not so close that you're impacting the quality of your line. And you can see that lines us up so that the S is on the outside and the H is on the outside, and holidays is pretty well centered underneath happy, which will look lovely on your cakes. Now we're going to tackle Happy New Year. So obviously it's going to start out pretty simple. We'll start out just the same with our happy. And for this one, I've done New Year on one line, but if you're working in a really tight space, don't be afraid to break this up into 3 lines of text if you need to. I always love doing little petite cakes for holidays because those are really easy for people to pick up when they just want something little to take over to a friend or maybe a small gathering. So, because of the length of New Year together, you can see we've got the N just outside of that H to keep us centered. And N's are one of those ones where when we're doing the capital, we can touch at the corners instead of stopping and picking up completely to make a nice, crisp letter with some really great sharp transitions. And we could do that on our W's as well. Just take your time as you go. It speeds us up a little bit, but not kind of race car driver speeds, more like quick little turtles. Always like to do my E's in 2 parts, just to make sure I don't lose that little hole, the gap in the center, because then you can end up looking more like a C than an E and that can be problematic for people being able to read our messages. And finish that with an R. So there we have two simple phrases that will encompass a lot of the holidays throughout the year. And they're pretty easy to write out because they both start the same way. And they're really great for helping to practice centering your messages on cakes. And you can do things like Happy New Year on 2 lines, let's say if you're doing something bigger. And you can break it up into 3 if you're going on something smaller, or if you have a lot of decorations on your cake that you need to get around the edges. Once you feel comfortable with this, go ahead and move on. If you feel like you need to practice it again, scrape it off and do it a few more times. That's all for this Practice With Me session. We hope you enjoyed our lesson on writing. We tried to include some really useful things from you, from common phrases that you're going to have to write on cakes a lot, to some different styles of alphabets and some little numerals and symbols that you're going to come across pretty readily. There is a link in the description if you'd like to get these templates, and it'll also be in the tagged product sections. So you can click either of those places if you're interested in getting these templates to help you with your practice sessions. And if you enjoyed this video, try checking out our other Practice With Me on our basic cake decorating skills. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like more about the cake decorating materials and equipment we use, or just some inspirational videos about cake decorating itself, you can follow us on Insta or YouTube at Cake Decorating School. If you'd like to know more about yearly membership and what it entails, you can go to www.cakedecoratingschool.com for more information. And if you're interested in these products, you can check the links in the description.